to this very short seminar on carbon accounting and the ISO 14067. So today we're trying a new format. We're going to keep this very, very brief. It's going to be 15 minutes. And Ursula, if you can go to the next slide. So a few words about us. My name is Elisabeth. I'm a freelance consultant in sustainability. My main topics are climate and regulation. So climate means, of course, carbon accounting, like CCF, PCF, so corporate carbon footprints, product carbon footprints, everything around that, and everything around regulation. In Europe, that's mainly the CSRD that is now relevant for many, many businesses. And with that, I pass over to my colleague, Ursula.
Hello, I am Ursula Navarro and I'm environmental engineering doing my PhD in Germany, and I am also a consultant in sustainability topics, especially on topics such as life cycle assessment or carbon footprint and risk assessment as well.
Perfect, thank you. So what are we doing today? So we will briefly introduce you to the ISO 14067-64 standard. What does the standard mean, and in terms of also for you measuring your carbon footprint. Then we will look at in more detail the greenhouse gas inventory categories that the ISO standard requires. We will also look at the legal context of carbon accounting in general. And finally, again, going into a little bit more detail, what does this mean in terms of data requirement and emissions reductions? So, what is the ISO 14064 standard? So, in general, the ISO standard is a framework to quantify, report, validate, and verify greenhouse gas emissions and removals. And if you go on to the next slide, what the ISO standard or this group really does is various things. So there is different ISO standards, I'm sure you're aware, and we're looking in particular at the 14064, which is split into 3 separate standards. And the first one of these is probably the one that you're most interested in, which describes how to measure the carbon footprint of an organization. However, the second one also does the same thing, but for a project. So if you're doing a project and you want to know what is the carbon footprint, this is the guidance that tells you how. And finally, the 14063 is the one that is interesting if you want to get your carbon footprint certified. So this is the guidance for auditors, and I was actually just on an ISO audit for carbon footprinting 2 weeks ago. So this is the guidance for the auditors that tells them how to do the verification. So in practice, just so you get a sneak preview in what that means, the auditor came to the business looking in a lot of detail at all the documentation and also trying to make sure that it's plausible, that there's the activities that are happening, that they're reasonably in line with what is written in the carbon footprint report. Also looking at all the receipts and the numbers, so there's a lot of detail in that whole verification process. But that aside, let's focus on the one that you're probably most interested in, the one on the organizational level. So if you go on the next slide, Ursula, the idea of the standard is, in particular, to ensure, amongst other things, that the carbon footprint is complete, so that we're not forgetting about anything, that it's consistent, that it's accurate, and that it's transparent. And if you click further, what does transparency mean? In particular, it means that we describe properly and accurately the organizational boundaries. So what is included in the carbon footprint, the reporting boundaries? Is there anything missing? You know, that maybe we are aware that there are emissions in certain parts, however, we have no way to measure them. This should be made transparent in the report. And then, of course, also things like the reporting period and other things. Yeah, and with that, I pass on to Ursula, who will tell you about the greenhouse gas inventory categories.
Okay, so when we're talking about categories, we're basically talking about the data and selecting specifically the activities that you want to or that you should incorporate in your calculations. So in the ISO is described six categories, and each of them has to do with a specific type of activity. Probably the one that requires more data is, of course, the direct one because it's specifically uh, that is linked to the activities that are from your company that you have operational economic ownership. And that's, for examples, we're talking about if your company is burning fuel or is using a specific type of fertilizer, etc. And then we were talking from category 2 to category 6. Here it's indirect emissions. So in this case are, for instance, all the activities that are not owned by your company, but that you're using for your processes. So for instance, we have for energy, here, if your company, of course, uses electricity, then you need to include this in your calculations. And if we go to category 6, then we're talking about indirect emissions, where you have to take into account different sources of emissions that are not directly from your company, but that you're, for instance, purchasing from others. And now for the legal requirements.
Yes, so legal requirements. Are you required as an organization to measure your carbon footprint? So the usual consultant answer is it depends. So, of course, if you fall, for example, under emissions trading schemes, so if you're a really huge corporation in a sector that has a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, steel industry, something like that, then your company is likely that it might fall under an emissions trading scheme. So, for example, in Europe we have one, but also in other countries there are emissions trading schemes, and that actually means you have to be extremely detailed about your carbon footprint calculation, because the requirements in this case are actually very strong. There are other cases where, for example, in Europe, if you fall under the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, then meaning that you're a business with more than 250 employees and some other criteria, then you will also have to calculate your carbon footprint. Technically, it depends on the outcome of the double materiality assessment. However, almost no business that I know can argue that carbon footprint or that climate is not material. That is a tough argument to make. I haven't seen it, so basically it means you have to measure your carbon footprint. And now the question for smaller businesses. You might not have to in terms of legal requirements. However, what happens quite often, and also with some of my customers, is that their customers fall under this regulation because their customers are huge companies. And in order to measure your carbon footprint as a big business, as Ursula described, you also have to create transparency on your emissions in your value chain. So if your customer falls under this regulation, they will ask you to supply information on your carbon footprint so that they can, fulfill their own legal requirements. So it's kind of a trickle down effect that we do see. So it might not be, direct legal requirements, but something that we see in terms of customers demanding their suppliers, their service providers to provide data on their greenhouse gas emissions.
So, what is the data needed for calculating my carbon footprint? So in this case, we need different types of data. For instance, in the previous slides that I showed you the division between direct and indirect emissions. In the case of the direct emissions, we will need data from, instance, the volume of certain fuel that you're using for transportation of certain parts of for your company, or we also can use monetary value, meaning the amount of money that you're using or spending in certain goods. And in indirect ones, we can also need the electricity that you're consuming for your services, etc. And in this, let's say, whole process of calculations, what we're interested in is into transforming or scaling the greenhouse gas emissions, 2 tons of CO2 equivalent. And the ISO establishes different types of steps that you should follow for your calculations in order for you to reduce uncertainty and increase accuracy of your calculations. And it's also suggesting that every calculation that you're doing, you have to make sure that you are justifying how you're doing the calculations, the sources that you're using for your calculations, and etc. So here in the slide, you can also see that for the calculations per se, you can either measure like with emission factors, meaning that you're basically doing calculations with based on your activities and also the amount of CO2 that this activity would emit. But you can also use models. So, for instance, there are different tools that you can use. In this case, I am just citing two, such as SimaPro or Gavi. However, you can also do it in a simple manner if you are just making sure that all your calculations are well justified. And lastly, for the reduction of carbon emissions, this is also a very important step that it's suggested in the ISO. So here we have divided basically whether your company meets these two criteria. So for instance, if your company has already implemented certain activities of greenhouse gas reduction, for example, if your company uses landfilling of a specific type of waste or do not, or for instance, your biogenic sources, your composting it, that those are types of greenhouse gas reduction initiatives. And in this case, you can you already have planned and implemented it, you can include it in your greenhouse gas calculations. And if you have not done that, then you can report which plans are you having in order to meet these reduction initiatives, and this has also needs to be clearly stated in your greenhouse gas report.
Yeah, and with that, we're basically at the end of our really short seminar. If you need help with calculating the carbon footprint in your own organization, please reach out. We're very happy to help. Also, if you have any questions, maybe you can move on to the next slide, Ursula. So we might be able to answer one very quick question. If you have one, feel free to type it in the chat. Everyone is happy. You have to be quick because time is short. And what we would also appreciate if you can move on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, we're trying this very quick format. So we're of course very curious. Did you like it? Was it too short? Would you like more deeper content? Let us know. Maybe you can just type a few words in the chat what you think about this speed seminar format. And with that, we've reached our end. If you have any more questions, please reach out. You can see the contacts on this slide. I'm very happy to answer any questions, and so is Ursula. Great, we have one participant writing they loved it. Awesome. And yeah, with that, we'll reach the end. Thank you very, very much for participating, and have a great rest of the day. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.